The cold winter's day, it was the kind of cold that could make a grown man pause mid-step, biting into your skin like 1,000 needles. The wind whipped through the trees, sending snowflakes swirling in unpredictable patterns. Robert Jameson, a 47-year-old widower with a quiet life in the small town of Pine Ridge, had grown accustomed to this kind of winter. He had lived through years of harsh seasons, having lost his wife to an illness 2 years ago, but something about this particular day felt different. It wasn't just the freezing temperature or the snow that had already accumulated on the ground like a heavy blanket. It was a feeling in the air that Robert couldn't quite shake. He pulled his thick woolen scarf tighter around his neck as he walked down the familiar path that led to his neighbor's house. The wind, despite the thick forest surrounding the town, seemed to find its way into every nook and cranny, biting harder each time. Thomas Keller, his elderly neighbor, had become somewhat of a recluse in recent months. Once a vibrant man with stories to tell of his younger days in the military, Thomas had withdrawn after the passing of his wife several years ago. Robert had always admired Thomas for his strength, for his resilience, but lately there had been an air of sadness around him. They had become close friends over the years, both men bonding over the loss of loved ones and the shared experience of surviving life's challenges. Robert often stopped by to check on him, even though Thomas would assure him that he was fine. But today, there was something unsettling in the back of Robert's mind, a nagging feeling that today was different. As he trudged through the deep snow, his breath visible in the freezing air, he couldn't shake the thought that something was off. The wind howled above, but the closer he got to Thomas's home, the quieter it became. There was no sign of life, no warm light in the windows, no sign of movement inside. The house, which was usually well kept, looked different today, as if something had shifted. The door was slightly ajar, the cold air pushing it back and forth in a slow, rhythmic motion. Robert stood frozen for a moment, his heart racing with unease. He had known Thomas for years, but never had he seen the door left open like this. His instincts kicked in, and he immediately stepped forward, pushing the door open with a creak. The house was eerily quiet, colder than it should have been for a house that was usually warm and welcoming. Robert's boots crunched against the wooden floors as he stepped deeper into the home, his voice calling out, "Thomas, it's Robert. You in here?" There was no reply. The air felt thick with silence, and Robert's heart began to race, his thoughts swirling with 1,000 possibilities. He glanced around the living room, noting the untouched chair by the fireplace and the stacks of books that had once been his neighbor's companions. He called out again, but this time, his voice seemed to disappear into the empty air. Just as he was about to turn and leave to find someone to help, something caught his eye. A trail of wet footprints led him toward the back of the house, to the kitchen. Robert's throat tightened as he followed the path, his mind racing. He knew something was terribly wrong. The kitchen was dark, save for the dim light coming from a small window. Robert reached for the handle of the back door, his heart pounding, and as he opened it, his breath caught in his throat. What he saw on the other side made his blood run cold. There, in the snow, was Thomas's malorder bride, Elena. Her body was crumpled in the snow, her face a ghastly shade of pale, her lips blue from the cold. She was freezing, her arms splayed out as if she had collapsed there in the middle of an attempt to escape. The dress she wore was thin and inadequate for such brutal weather, and her bare feet were already beginning to freeze to the ground. Robert's chest tightened, and for a moment he stood frozen, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. His instincts kicked in, and without thinking, he rushed toward her, scooping her up in his arms. As his body made contact with hers, the coldness sent a jolt of panic through him. She was still alive, barely but the chances of her surviving. This was slim unless he acted quickly. Without hesitation, he carried Elena back inside the house, his mind racing with the impossibility of the situation. How had she gotten out here? What had happened to Thomas? The questions flooded his mind, but he knew there was no time for answers now. Elena's life was in his hands, and in that moment, Robert felt the weight of responsibility heavier than it had ever been before. He laid her by the fire, her body trembling uncontrollably as he tried to warm her with blankets and heat. As he worked, the reality of what he had found slowly began to sink in. Whatever had happened here, it was more than just a tragedy, was a miracle waiting to unfold. The desperation asterisk as Robert wrapped Elena in blankets. He could feel her body shivering uncontrollably, her skin still cold to the touch, despite the warmth of the fire. His mind raced. What was he supposed to do now? She was in critical condition, and with the phone lines down because of the snowstorm, there was no way to call for help. Panic crept up his spine, but he forced it down, focusing solely on the task at hand. He checked her pulse weak, but there, he felt a fleeting sense of relief. She was alive, for now, but how long would that last? The frostbite on her exposed skin was severe, and he knew that if he didn't act fast, it could be too late. He had no medical experience to speak of, but Robert wasn't one to sit idle in times of need. With trembling hands, he gathered the supplies he could find, some old bandages from his own first aid kit, a heating pad, and some water. He gently began to thaw her frozen limbs, applying heat slowly, trying not to do more harm than good. Elena's breathing remained shallow, and Robert couldn't help but wonder how long she had been out in the cold. The thought of her being left alone outside, in that state, broke something inside of him. He couldn't fathom how anyone, especially Thomas, who had always been so caring toward her, could have allowed this to happen. But there were no answers yet, only the haunting image of her frozen body in the snow, asterisk as the minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Robert's frustration mounted. He couldn't help but feel guilty. He should have visited earlier, should have checked in more often. But time was something he couldn't get back, and now all he could do was pray. His hands clasped together as he knelt by her side, and in a whisper he begged, "Please, God, don't let her die like this. She deserves so much more." He wasn't sure who he was praying to, whether it was a higher power, fate, or simply his own fear talking, but in that moment, it felt like his hope was the only thing he had left. He continued to work, trying to thaw her out, all the while unsure if his efforts would be enough. The impossible miracle asterisk hours passed, though Robert wasn't sure if it had been 2 or 10. Time seemed to stretch and warp in that moment, as though the ticking clock itself was suspended by the weight of uncertainty. The fire crackled steadily beside them, its warmth filling the room. But it wasn't enough to chase away the overwhelming chill that had taken hold of Robert's mind. He sat by Elena's side, his fingers gently brushing the damp strands of hair from her face, still trying to bring some sense of life back into her frozen body. But no matter how much warmth he added, or how many layers of blankets he draped over her, nothing seemed to change. Her breathing remained slow and shallow, her lips still tinged blue. The faint pulse in her wrist felt like it could slip away at any moment, and Robert could do nothing but watch helplessly, Asterisk frustration began to swell within him, threatening to overpower the calm facade he was desperately trying to maintain. He had tried everything he knew. He had done his best to keep her warm, to tend to her frozen limbs, to give her the care she needed. But the more he worked, the more helpless he felt. There was nothing left for him to do but wait, and that was the hardest part. To sit, to watch, to wait as someone's life hung in the balance, with no certainty as to whether it would tip toward life or death. It felt like a cruel joke that fate was playing on him. He had done everything he could, but Elena's survival seemed just beyond his reach. Asterisked it was in that moment, when Robert was at his lowest, that something extraordinary happened. The room, which had been so still and heavy with tension, suddenly seemed to hum with an inexplicable energy. The temperature in the room shifted subtly, as if the very air around him had been infused with life. Robert couldn't explain it, but something in his gut told him that something was changing. Then, almost as if in direct response to his quiet, desperate prayer, Elena's breathing deepened. It wasn't a dramatic change, not immediately noticeable to the untrained eye, but Robert's heart leaped in his chest when he saw the faint rise of her chest. Her lips, which had been stiff and blue, were now gaining a faint hint of color. The warmth that had been absent was slowly returning, like the sun breaking through the clouds after a storm. Elena's eyelids fluttered, and for a moment Robert wondered if he was imagining it. Could this really be happening? Was it possible that after all this time, after all the hopelessness, Elena was waking up? He leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat as he gently called her name, Elena, ... Elena, can you hear me? His voice was rough, hoarse from hours of exertion, but he didn't care. Her eyes opened, first slowly, then more alert. She blinked several times, as if trying to make sense of her surroundings. Robert could hardly believe what he was seeing. Her eyes, though clouded with confusion, were open alive, filled with a spark he thought had been lost forever. Asterisk where ... where am I? Elena whispered, her voice raspy, weak, but unmistakably alive. The moment she spoke, Robert's heart flooded with relief, a deep, overwhelming sense of gratitude flooding his chest. He could hardly believe it. The woman who had been so close to death just hours ago, lying frozen in the snow, was now speaking, breathing, and alive. He could hardly contain the tears that filled his eyes as he squeezed her hand gently, not wanting to let go for fear that it was all some kind of dream. Asterisk, you're safe, Robert said, his voice breaking. You're safe now, Elena. You made it. You're going to be okay. His words were simple, but in them there was a promise. A promise that she wasn't alone anymore, that he wouldn't let her slip away. The miracle he had silently prayed for was unfolding before him, and in that moment, Robert realized that some things in life were simply beyond explanation, beyond reason. What had happened in this small, quiet house in the middle of a snowstorm, what had unfolded between the desperate prayer of a man and the survival of a woman who should not have made it, was nothing short of a miracle. And as Elena continued to wake up, slowly but surely, Robert knew that life, in all its mysterious ways, still held the power to surprise, to heal, and to deliver the impossible new beginning. Asterisk, the days that followed were filled with the quiet rhythm of recovery. Elena remained in Robert's care, and as the snowstorm outside finally began to wane, the town of Pine Ridge slowly returned to its usual quiet pace. The miracle of her survival spread quickly through the community. Neighbors, who had once regarded the Jameson house with mere nods of familiarity, now came by, bringing food, offers of help, and words of astonishment. They were all in awe of Elena's resilience, but none more than Robert himself. Every time he looked at her, he couldn't believe that just days ago she had been lying frozen and lifeless in the snow, with no chance of survival. Now she was. Sitting by the fire, sipping warm tea, her cheeks flushed with health, and a faint but genuine smile on her face. Robert spent his days ensuring she had everything she needed. But there was something more that Elena needed, something more than physical recovery. She had been through so much, stripped of her warmth, her safety, her sense of security, and, as the days passed, it became clear that she was not only healing physically but emotionally too. Robert noticed the way her eyes would occasionally dart to the window, as though she was waiting for someone or something. He knew what she had been through with Thomas, though the full story remained locked behind her silence. She had married the man in the hopes of finding a better life, but instead, she had found herself in a desperate situation, abandoned and alone in the cold, left to perish in the snow. It was a harsh truth that weighed heavily on both of them, and yet, in that moment, Robert knew that there was still hope for her, hope for a life beyond what she had endured. It wasn't long before Thomas, too, began to show signs of change. The guilt that had eaten away at him for days began to lift, replaced with a sense of responsibility. He had been unable to help Elena in her darkest hour, but seeing her alive, watching her slowly regain her strength, gave him the courage to face the reality of his actions. He visited Robert's house daily, sitting quietly beside Elena, offering apologies without words, simply being present in a way that he never had before. They didn't speak much, but in those quiet moments, the healing began for both of them. It was clear that their marriage, which had seemed so fragile, was now being reshaped. Not by grand gestures, but by the small acts of understanding. By the time spent together in the stillness of recovery, the transformation was not immediate, nor was it without its struggles, but it was genuine. The warmth that had once been absent from their lives began to seep in. Elena started to speak, more openly, sharing her fears, her hopes for the future, and slowly, a bond began to form, not just between her and Thomas, but between her and Robert as well. They were, in a strange way, a family now. A family that had been forged through tragedy but was healing through love and understanding. They began to rebuild their lives, step by step, without rushing. Elena's new beginning was not just about surviving. It was about living again, truly living. And as Robert watched them both start anew, he realized that sometimes the most miraculous things in life didn't come from grand gestures or unbelievable feats. They came from simple acts of kindness, from the willingness to believe in second chances, and from the grace of life itself. In the days that followed, as the snow began to melt and the harsh winter gave way to spring, the town of Pine Ridge saw a change in its people. They began to speak more openly about forgiveness, about recovery, and about the unexpected miracles that had touched their lives. Robert knew that his life, too, would never be the same. The miracle he had witnessed, the miracle that had brought Elena back from the brink of death, had shown him the power of faith, of second chances, and of the unspoken bond that connects us all. And as he looked out over the town, with the snow finally melting and the sun beginning to shine again, Robert knew that no matter what lay ahead, he had witnessed something extraordinary. He had witnessed the impossible become possible, and for that he was eternally grateful.